I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my trusty co-host, David Feldman. Hello, David. Good to see you. I mean, I actually don't see you because we're on radio, but to hear you. Hello.
It's better off that you just hear me.
Well, that's not going to be for long because...
What are you? Am I no longer going to be a part of the show?
No, you are, but we're going to do a live Zoom recording of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour in a couple of weeks.
Oh.
Yes. Do good people want power? We want good people to have power. Or do they just want to talk about it? That will be the theme of an upcoming program, and we want you to be part of it. Join us on Wednesday, December 15th. That's Wednesday, December 15th, a couple of weeks at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time for a live recording of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Our guest will be Richard Panchik. He's the author of the new book, Power to the People. And there will be an opportunity to ask him and Ralph your questions about how we can fight for our rights as citizens and consumers against entrenched corporate power. It's going to be very exciting. We haven't done this before. We hope we can pull it off.
This is very exciting, Steve. It's an opportunity for our listeners to sit in a virtual studio audience and watch a live recording of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. All you need is a Zoom account, and you can just sit in and watch how we put the show together and ask questions.
Right. And for more information on how to sign up, go to ralphnaderradiohour.com. And speaking of ralphnaderradiohour.com, we actually have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
We're going to start today's show. We're talking about the opioid crisis. Right now, it's common knowledge that the Sackler family, who ran Purdue Pharma, the makers of OxyContin, bears the lion's share of the blame for fueling an addiction that continues to take thousands of lives, tears families apart, and destroys entire communities. But according to our first guest, Ryan Hampton, the Sacklers had a lot of willing accomplices. He states that they committed, quote, cold-blooded corporate genocide, rubber-stamped by the FDA and co-signed by the free market, unquote. And many of those accomplices were the ones tasked with holding them accountable, which they didn't in any meaningful way. Mr. Hampton was co-chair of the official creditor committee that was supposed to be watchdogging Purdue's bankruptcy proceedings. This committee of creditors included representatives from insurance companies, hospitals, and pharmacies. And Mr. Hampton was one of only 4 actual victims on that committee. In his new book, Unsettled, How the Purdue Pharma Bankruptcy Failed the Victims of the American Overdose Crisis, he pulls back the curtain on how the system of corporate bankruptcy does more to protect the criminals than bring justice to the victims. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our tireless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's hear about how Purdue Pharma's killing spree was aided and abetted by the American injustice system. David?
Ryan Hampton is a national addiction recovery advocate, community organizer, and author. His latest book is Unsettled, How the Purdue Pharma Bankruptcy Failed the Victims of the American Overdose Crisis. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Ryan Hampton.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Welcome indeed, Ryan. This book covers a lot of ground, and I noticed that you're not just focusing on the Purdue Pharmaceutical Company or the Sackler family who owned it, but you say that you want people to understand, and I'm quoting you, that the Sacklers, Purdue, and many of the states and government actors were all hiding the truth from the American public. All of them are to blame. They all profited by maintaining the status quo, harming people, whether that was their intention or not. But I think when it comes to the Sackler family in Purdue, I think you indicate that they really knew what was happening to millions of people with their unbridled promotion of OxyContin and these pharmaceutical tentacles as they had throughout the country. You say the story of Purdue Pharma, the billionaire family that owned it, that's the Sackler family, and the carnage they wreaked on unsuspecting Americans is what you're talking about. So why don't you tell our listeners, some of whom may not be fully aware of the carnage, the number of people who have died, wreckage among millions of families, and to this day, they may not be aware of it. So I want you just to lay the predicate for your book before we get into some of the details. What was the carnage and how did it inflict itself on so many people?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to know that we're in an unprecedented overdose crisis right now that's driven mainly by illicit fentanyl. But a lot of this started kind of the Pandora's box for the current day overdose crisis, had a lot to do with Purdue Pharma, had a lot to do with pharmaceutical oxycodone, Oxycontin. You know, we think of the Sackler family as the first family of big pharma, and rightly so for many reasons. They released Oxycontin in the 90s, utilizing tactics that were criminal and false advertising and false marketing. In fact, they pretty much wrote their own new drug approval or NDA with the FDA in the late 90s. They made a statement called the delayed absorption statement, which they knew to be false, that said that when the oxycodone made it through the bloodstream over the course of 12 hours, which their product allowed it to through its coding versus just instant release, that the risk of addiction was less than 1%, which they knew was false. As I write in the book, you know, Dr. Curtis Wright, who was with the FDA and who was the individual who was responsible for writing their new drug approval in the 90s, the late 90s, invited representatives from Purdue Pharma to meet him at a hotel in Rockville, Maryland, right near the FDA, to actually write the drug approval for the FDA. Let me repeat that. Purdue Pharma wrote their own drug approval that went on to be approved by the Food and Drug Administration. It would be no surprise to folks that Dr. Curtis Wright, just a few years later, retired from the FDA and took a job making close to $400,000 a year at Purdue Pharma. These were some of the tactics that the company employed. When Oxycontin started showing up in the pockets of coal mine workers in Appalachia, or people who were going to pill clinics in South Florida, and overdoses started to really ratchet up in the 2000s. And this data was coming back to Purdue, and they saw where these prescriptions were coming from, and they saw the correlation between where the hot spots were for the overdoses and where the hot spots were for the pill clinics and where the prescribers were. We could imagine another world where Purdue, you know, said, hey, there's a problem here. We need to do something. We need to start working with prescribers. We need to start working with the federal government. We need to make sure that these overdose numbers are going down. No, instead of doing that, led by Dr. Richard Sackler and Sackler family members who sat on the board of directors and controlled it up until recently, they doubled down. They offered incentives to those prescribers, which they called super whales, in the means of speaking fees and gifts and international trips. And they wanted to keep that pill pipeline open. That's how I got caught up in it. I wasn't just a victims representative on the unsecured creditors committee. I almost lost my life to Oxycontin multiple times. I was prescribed in a doctor's office, someone that we're, you know, taught to trust, and someone who lived this myself. You know, we can't forget also that Purdue is now a serial federal offender, right? I mean, they pled guilty in federal court in 2007 to these crimes. 3 executives pled guilty, right? No one ever served any jail time. And recently they pled guilty again in October of 2020 for utilizing the same marketing tactics that they were found guilty for in 2007. So, I mean, this has been a story that's been coming along. The Sackler family made billions of dollars, right, off of their blockbuster product, Oxycontin. I think people oftentimes forget that one of the biggest beneficiaries of Oxycontin's success actually happens to be the federal government in the terms of taxes, right? I mean, they've taken over $5 billion from the family in taxes. And that's something I write about in the book and was maddening to me. But that's kind of how we got here. But we're now in a place where overdose death is more prevalent than car accidents, gun violence. For every 8 COVID deaths here in the United States, we have 1 reported overdose death. This crisis is getting out of control and the death curve continues to tick up. Yet the Sackler family, as a result of the process that was laid out and prescribed before them by the bankruptcy code, will walk away without a single indictment, ever sitting for a grand jury, and paying off, $4.5 billion and walking off into the sunset while my friends and people I care about in my community continue to die.
And the Sackler family is still worth over $14 billion. And the $4 billion plus they agreed to was spread over 10 years. It seemed like, as your book points out, that big money corrupted everybody that touched it. It corrupted the FDA. It corrupted other government officials at state level. It corrupted the pharmacies who went along with this, and they knew that they were overprescribing and huge amounts were pouring into West Virginia, rural areas. Where are all those pills going? It corrupted everybody it touched, and it betrayed the public's trust. I mean, people hear the words Food and Drug Administration. They don't know that a large part of its budget is paid by the drug industry with a law that passed in Congress, supposedly to save the taxpayer money. And then the FDA turns around, as you say, and lets the Sackler family and its buffer company, Purdue, write the actual approval for this drug, which, of course, minimized the warnings and wrote it in a public relations way to favor the company. But the immediate question is, did they get away with this in other countries, Ryan? I mean, Canada, Europe, Japan, did they crack down more than the toady Food and Drug Administration?
So they did get away with it in other countries, although they were exposed pretty heavily in Italy. Mundy Pharma is the international arm of Purdue. I mean, they have not faced any type of criminal charges in other countries, although they were exposed pretty heavily for a lot of their efforts in Italy. In respect to Canada, Canada is actually caught up in the bankruptcy right now. So, I mean, Canada is one of the creditors in the United States bankruptcy. So that's an ongoing kind of live ball discussion with respect to some of the international arms. The Sackler family has, and I write about it in Unsettled, it has been very hard to track their wealth because they have these things called IACs, which are independent associated companies all over the world where their money is spread, and tracking those dollars was a nightmare. I mean, I sat in every deposition, read, tens of thousands of pages of discovery, and really the estimate that you put on how much they're worth is a conservative estimate because it's probably more than that. We just don't know where the money is. But money corrupting the process, people have to know it's still corrupting the process today as we have this conversation. The Sackler family, at the end of paying that settlement, after 9 to 10 years, and it's $4.5 billion, right? Just based on their current investments that they get to keep and a standard kind of moderate interest rate, they will be able to pay back that $4.5 billion and net possibly $1 billion on top of it. So at the end of this, they will be richer than they are today and have paid the settlement back. That is insanity. This bankruptcy, it wasn't a bankruptcy, it was a heist. It was a scam. It was a money grab. When this is all said and done, we hear all the headlines about the bankruptcy. People don't oftentimes talk about the victims. The government, the Department of Justice, the state attorneys general say they're doing this for the victims. 130,000 victims who have claims in this bankruptcy will have to share, if the plan is ultimately, held up on appeal and confirmed, will have to share in $750 million, an average payout of $5,000 per family. The most a mother or father will receive if their child overdosed and died from this product is $48,000. And proving that claim and that harm, the barriers are extremely, extremely tall.
Listeners should know that the most recent modes of evaluating and judging petitions for bankruptcy, what's called Chapter 11, by crooked companies or companies that are terribly mismanaged, has developed a level of immunity unlike ever conceived by corporate lawyers in the past. It's not just what Ryan points out. It's not only is it a get out of jail card when the judge approves the bankruptcy conditions, but it allows them to escape civil lawsuits under tort law, and it allows them to make actually a profit. Because the Sackler family, according to your book, Ryan, took $10 billion out of the Purdue company starting in 2008 and put it in all kinds of so-called trusts around the world, and they immunized that money from being taken by the lawsuits brought by state attorney generals and private plaintiff lawyers. Right. So this is beyond the imagination of writers of fiction about corporate fugitives from justice. And Congress is deep into this, except for Senator Elizabeth Warren, who wants to reform these bankruptcy laws. And listeners should know that individuals can't get away with this with bankruptcy. There now is a double standard. The privileges, immunities, escape from justice under corporate bankruptcy laws are far, far more enabling than any debtor who tries to start a clean slate and declares bankruptcy for a few $1,000s of debt. This is a double standard. Someday it should be challenged under the equal protection laws of the U.S. Constitution. But as you say, this family, the Sackler family, has its name on a number of philanthropic institutions, including in Washington, D.C. Why aren't people demanding, the way they demand to take Jefferson and Lincoln off names, why aren't people demanding to take the names of the Sacklers off these institutions, especially the big one in Washington?
Well, they are, Ralph. I mean, I worked a lot with Nan Golden and other activists. I mean, we've had actions in front of the Smithsonian. It was one of the first protests that I helped put together in 2018 to demand that the Smithsonian take the Sackler name off their art wing there, right on the Capitol Mall.
What are they saying?
No comment, no response from them, right? I mean, it is maddening. What's also maddening, though, and some institutions like Tufts and other universities have begun to take the Sackler name down. But in the bankruptcy plan, right, like one of the more upsetting things is that the state attorneys general, activists were calling for this for a long time on banning the Sackler name from philanthropic institutions. They negotiated a deal with the Sacklers that their name, if the plan is confirmed, cannot be on philanthropic institutions until they've paid their $4.5 billion in total. Once they've paid their settlement, their name can go back up on these institutions. You know, is a maddening kind of small point in the bankruptcy plan. But I want to just address one thing to go back to the $10 billion that the Sacklers had withdrawn. There was a memo, and I write about this extensively, the week after the 2007 consent judgment. There was a memo from an executive at Purdue that was written to Jonathan Sackler, Richard Sackler's brother, also on the board, one of the executives of the company, about how to diversify the family's money and to protect them. And they recommended certain actions that the family take. In the 8 to 10 years prior to that $10 billion withdrawal, the Sackler family had only withdrawn something like $1 billion from the company. And after the 2007 guilty plea, they knew that the states and that other, potential litigants had their sights set on the Sacklers and quickly started withdrawing dollars out of the company. So they have been preparing for this bankruptcy for quite some time.
Without this bankruptcy shield, there would have been a lot of law enforcement actions. There would have been civil actions that would be more effective. There would have been follow-up on the criminal cases. Yes. And so before we get to the intricacies of the bankruptcy and Judge Drain, who presided over it, and the plaintiff lawyers and the defense lawyers and the state attorney generals, the reason why I raised the name Sackler on these institutions is because they are now moving to eliminate the last remaining social sanction for their crimes, which is stigma. Mm-hmm. Stigma. And it shows you the power that these corporations have. They escape from regulation. They escape essentially from criminal prosecution. None of these people are going to jail. They escape from the state attorney generals. And now they want to escape from stigma, the sanction, and just come back and start their mode of operating and getting more profits all along. So let's ask this question. What is the state of Purdue Pharma now? It's supposed to be, it is in bankruptcy, but it's coming out in some sort of public trust for the victims. Is that too much to describe or what?
So it's being restructured as it's no longer Purdue Pharma. It's a new company. It's kind of known as NewCo as a abbreviation for new company. The board of directors is going to be appointees of state attorneys general or attorneys general themselves. It's being reformulated into a public benefit corporation. So all proceeds and revenue from the company and profit from the company will be going into the NOAT, which is the National Opioid Abatement Trust, to pay the settlement. It will continue to sell OxyContin, to drive profits and drive revenue. Without the sale of OxyContin, there is no settlement. I think that's one thing people need to understand is that, what people think is a substantial settlement, I think it's nothing, but there's nothing without the Sackler contribution of $4.5 billion and without a reformulated Purdue Pharma as a public benefit corporation to continue selling OxyContin. But the control of the company will now be the states, which does give me pause because it now becomes an issue of who regulates the regulators, right? The government is now essentially in the business of selling opioids, selling OxyContin, right? And I think there needs to be pause for anyone. OxyContin inherently is not a bad medication. Opioids are not inherently bad. It's how they're marketed, right? It's how they're put into the market, how the Sacklers weaponize the American medicine cabinet. So to drive profits, it is concerning that the government controls because, who calls the shots then? Who holds them accountable?
It's like China. The Chinese government invested into the tobacco industry, and they had a conflict of interest between their public health responsibilities and the huge revenues that were coming in because of the sales. But let's go into the circles of irresponsibility here, Ryan. And I beseech you to try to be a little brief because we're going to cover a lot of circles. Congress. Did Congress hold hearings? What did it do and didn't do in your judgment?
Well, I think Congress has had a few hearings on the topic, but they've done nothing. The Sackler Act was proposed in March, just this past March, to eliminate the releases for the Sacklers, yet the government and Congress knew that the Sacklers wanted these releases when they filed for bankruptcy in September of 2019. They were about 18 months late to the game. Bankruptcy reform has been on and off as a hot topic. But no, Congress knows what the problem is. Congress isn't moving. We've seen some performative gestures.
Did members return contributions that were made politically to them by the Sackler family?
Yes, we have seen contributions return from individuals, but they were small. They were small contributions, $1,000 here, $1,000 there, maybe $2,800 once in a while. I think it's notable to know, though, that even in the midst of the bankruptcy, in the middle of the process, my committee discovered that the Democratic Attorneys General Association, the Republican Attorneys General Association, the Democratic Governors Association, and the Republican Governors Association were accepting six-figure contributions from Purdue Pharma in the middle of the bankruptcy. In the middle of the process, still taking checks from them.
That's beyond anybody's level of cynicism. That is really gross. So Congress, in summary, they have not passed any corrective legislation. They have not passed reform of the atrocious get-out-of-jail bankruptcy system. Let's go to the Justice Department. What have they done, and what do you think they should have done or should do now? Because there's no statute of limitation on crimes like that.
Right. I'm actually headed to Washington, D.C. tomorrow morning on a plane to go stand out in front of the Justice Department with about 100 advocates from around the country to call for Attorney General Merrick Garland and Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco to use the evidence that they have to prosecute the Sacklers criminally. The Department of Justice settled civilly with the Sackler family in October of 2020. They said at the time that, criminal prosecution was still on the table. My understanding from kind of the backdoor deals and the Department of Justice was in all of the mediation meetings that I was in during the bankruptcy was that because they've accepted a civil settlement, even though they are saying publicly that they can still charge criminally, they're likely not to charge criminally, because if they do that, the Sacklers will, obviously pull back their $4.5 billion contribution, of which the federal government is taking a chunk. I recently found out just through a simple search through federal government records that the chief counsel to Attorney General Garland is a former lead attorney at Sidley Austin, who before she joined the administration and the Department of Justice was a lawyer representing Purdue Pharma.
So there was no grand jury convened for the Sackler family.
Not only is there no grand jury, in 20 years, not one single member of the Sackler family has faced an indictment or sat for a grand jury. They didn't do it in 2007. They didn't do it in 2020, and they're not doing it today. I have friends who are sitting in jail for simple marijuana charges, serving time in jail for marijuana, right? And the Sacklers will never, ever even have to sit for a grand jury, or haven't yet.
What a comparison, huh? That's why you should have on some of your signs in front of the Justice Department, call it the Injustice Department, presiding over the criminal injustice system. Somebody caught with a joint or with a couple ounces of marijuana over the years goes to jail for 5-10 years, and these corporate criminals escape. Now, to be fair to the Sackler family, they repeatedly say to the media, "We didn't do anything wrong. We didn't do anything wrong." Tell us what they did wrong.
I mean, we know what they did wrong. I mean, they used criminal tactics. Their marketing was wrong. They weaponized, like I said before, the American medicine cabinet with the product they knew could kill people.
We're talking with Ryan Hampton, author of The Gripping, and I say that as understatement. The book Unsettled, How the Purdue Pharma Bankruptcy Failed the Victims of the American Overdose Crisis. Give us an idea what the marketing was. First, the marketing to the pharmacies, the marketing to the doctors, and then the marketing to the public.
Right. I mean, it all goes down to their claim of OxyContin is less than 1% addictive. Their claim around, David Haddix, who is an executive at Purdue, around pseudo addiction, that people who may feel dependent on the drug, they're not addicted, they're just pseudo addicted, which means that it's just a side effect of the medication. Things that I experienced, right? Like I was told, my doctor was told that you had this less than 1% chance to become addicted, which makes the product seem way safer, completely safe actually, when it wasn't, right? Like they had the data, they had the science, they knew this was a lie, and they sold it to the American public, and the FDA helped them do it. They used tactics with Practice Fusion, right? Which was this marketing apparatus that was used in front of doctors that would push OxyContin and Purdue opioids to the top of the list when people were asking for some sort of pain care, and they were incentivizing those doctors to do it. They were essentially paying doctors to prescribe this medication and pass on this lie, right? You've got to look at the larger problem here too, though, which is allowing highly addictive, problematic narcotics to be marketed like they're Coca-Cola, or marketed like it's McDonald's, or marketed like it's some other household product. That's what Purdue did, and they used lies to do it. That is criminal.
Did they advertise it on TV? Did they advertise it on TV?
Television, radio, direct mail, promotional products, trips and junkets for doctors, financial incentives for doctors, right?
And all along, people were dying in communities all over the country. You go to any community in the country, and you say to someone, do you know anybody in the neighborhood who's died because they took this so-called painkiller that actually killed them? And they say, oh, yeah, I know. She was 19 years old and had all the promise in life, and she took it. So we're talking here big numbers, listeners. What's the official estimate? How many people have died from this Purdue Pharma drug over the last 15 years?
Right. Well, from OxyContin, they're looking at numbers that are probably, their market share was small. From prescription opioids, though, you're looking at about 400,000. But it's important to know, right? And this was my case. My addiction started with a Purdue product, right? And Purdue had many products, right? Hydromorphone was another one of theirs, and OxyContin. But I then went on because once more people started using OxyContin, the prices started to go up. So it was a supply and demand issue. Many users of OxyContin, people who were misusing it, then moved on to other drugs when they couldn't afford the OxyContin anymore. That I moved on to heroin, right? And it almost killed me. So a lot of the deaths that we see every year, right, where it's like someone died of a heroin overdose or a fentanyl overdose or some other, drug overdose, for a lot of people in the last 10 years, those addictions started in a doctor's office or with a prescription. We're going into this whole new third wave of the opioid crisis now, where illicit fentanyl is kind of in everything. And so it's a whole new ball game. But a lot of us who had issues with other drugs down the line, it started with OxyContin. So it's hard to actually, because we don't have good data on that, it's hard to actually say this many people died from OxyContin.
You're talking about the deadly forces this drug put in motion. Fentanyl is probably the deadliest thing you could pick up on the streets today. And I know you're a major figure in the recovery movement, which we'll talk about in a moment. But just to continue the circle, tell us about the law firms. Tell us about the plaintiff law firms, the corporate law firms. Name the corporate law firms who love to be anonymous.
Sure. There were several of them. One of the things that I realized early on, right, when I joined the committee was, there was a group of law firms and lawyers who were supposed to be on opposite sides, and they knew each other. It felt like they played golf on the weekends or vacationed with each other's families. And because I was the co-chair of this committee, I had to sign off on a lot of the bills that were going to the estate. And I started seeing bills for 20 million, 30 million, going up 40, $50 million paying attorneys.
Legal bills.
Legal bills. So Aiken Gump was the law firm that represented just my committee, the creditors committee. They've been paid over something like $140 million so far. The plaintiff lawyers, though, in general, when you put them all in one bucket, right? The plaintiff lawyers, the contingency lawyers that worked for the states, the contingency lawyers that worked for the victims, the NAS babies and others, they will, when this is, and I know I said in the book a little bit over $1 billion, but now it's actually eking closer to $1.5 billion. Over 1,000 lawyers and consultants in this case, under 1,000, will take home, if this plan is confirmed, over $1.5 billion. $1.5 billion when over 130,000 victims will have to share in $750 million. Average payout of $5,000 each family. That is a crime in itself. A coalition of firms that bill themselves as the opioid justice team that purport to represent families impacted by NAS babies don't care, and I write about this in the book, I believe don't care at all about NAS babies. They threw junk science into this bankruptcy to beef up their claims. They don't care about how much their clients actually get. They care about how much they're going to get paid. The legal system, the tort system, right? The way that these kind of vulture lawyers were able to just descend on the carcass of Purdue and start picking it apart just blew my mind. I've never seen anything like it.
You say they were close to the corporate lawyers representing Purdue and the Sackler
Oh, of
family?
course. Oh, yes, very much. And all of them were, though, like the lawyers, Pillsbury Law Firm and Andrew Troop and all these like lawyers that were representing the consenting states and the non-consenting states and the plaintiff lawyers. They were all in cahoots, I believe, with Davis Polk. You know, people think of bankruptcy and they think, well, like Purdue's on the stand, like they're the defendant, right? Nothing can be further from the truth. Purdue's law firm, Davis Polk, self-proclaimed in open court that they were basically the conductor of the process. And that was true. They led the process. If Purdue wasn't willing to do something, it didn't happen. You know, people think of bankruptcy court and bankruptcy process like some sort of trial. It's not an examination of the facts. It's not an examination of the truth. The debtor, who you think of like as the defendant, they run the entire process. They run the show. So everybody needed to be close to Davis Polk. Everybody needed to be close to Marshall Huebner, right? Who was their chief counsel, who is someone I just absolutely can't stand. He used to make claims that because there were 4 victims on the UCC and there were 5 corporate creditors, that if there was a 5-4 vote, right, in the favor of the company, that victims supported it because the votes were secret. Right? I mean, that was another setup. The Department of Justice knew that they couldn't seat a majority of victims on that unsecured creditors committee because they knew how that would go down.
This looks like another book on the lawyers. I hope some law professors listening and can write a book on this part of the story. But the litigation is not quite over because, as you know, most of the state attorney generals folded, including the most courageous one in terms of her past cases, Attorney General Healy of Massachusetts. Right. But I checked this out. There is an appeal that's going up, and the following attorney generals are standing firm against this atrocious settlement or surrender or capitulation, and they are led by the Attorney General of Connecticut, Attorney General Tong, the Attorney Generals of California, Delaware, D.C., Maryland, Oregon, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Washington State. That's the only thing left that might turn this thing around, and the chances are not great, but at least they didn't throw in the towel. So that's where they are, listeners.
Yeah, I want to say really quick, though, about that it is important to know that if, let's say the appeal is thorny to me, because I wish we would have had this information before they got so far down into the plan. Because if this appeal is successful, there is no mechanism right now that protects that paltry sum, that $750 million for the victim creditors. Essentially, that will be the first thing to go because the state attorney generals, and I write about this in the book, the states negotiated that the victim's settlement, that $750 million, would all come from the Sackler money, right? So if they get rid of the releases, the states will still get paid. The victims won't get paid though, right? And it was just another setup from day one. What we want criminal charges. We want criminal charges. So even if this appeal is successful, there's still no criminal case on the docket right now.
It's a very limited appeal, to be sure. But isn't there some hope from the cities and states that are now suing the giant pharmacies, Walgreens, CVS, and others, for reckless prescribing? Do you see any opportunity there to get more funds back for the recovery process of the victims?
No, I see a recovery process for the states, which is something we didn't have enough time to talk about, but all of the money in the multi-district litigation in these pharmacies will be going to government creditors. It's one of the maddening parts of this whole process. The only apparatus for victims to participate, actual human beings, was through the Purdue bankruptcy. Actual individuals will not be receiving any money for past harms done to them because the government has stepped in and said that they kind of have administrative claim over this. They will recover all the money. Of course, they will probably do some good with it, build a better system, hopefully. It won't become a tobacco 2.0, hopefully. But the actual humans whose lives were destroyed by this product, these products, these companies, there is no mechanism other than the Purdue Pharma bankruptcy for any recovery, which is why I am hyper concerned on how this appeal happens, that if they don't protect that $750 million for victims, we've been completely robbed of any single shred of justice that we could have.
Well, you know what, listeners, the cities and states in suing the pharmacies, and they also sued the company, they're all claiming that they had to pay a lot of social service funds for all the victims and that they had to try to help, and they want to recover that money. And if they do recover that money, obviously a good deal of it should go back to trying to reduce the problem in the first place and help some of the patients that can be helped in this way. So that's the circuitous way of saying that there is some sliver of hope left, but you and a lot of others working this, you want justice, not just compensation. You want criminal prosecution.
That's absolutely right.
That looks like that's been dissipated by this grotesque bankruptcy system they have for corporations. Steve, David, I'm sure you want to ask Ryan some questions or make some points in the remaining time.
Pete Buttigieg, our Secretary of Transportation, worked for McKinsey, and they're a management consulting group. Can you tell me the role that McKinsey played in all this? And McKinsey also invests in for-profit treatment centers, as does Mitt Romney's Bain Capital. There's big money in treating opiate addiction. So the second part of my question is, can somebody kick opiate addiction without going through a for-profit rehab center?
So it's a two-part question there. I'll just first say with McKinsey had a huge role to play in the opioid overdose crisis, but also in the Purdue case. So specific to Purdue, and I went through, dozens and dozens of internal McKinsey documents. I talk about some of them in Unsettled, but they advised Purdue to incentivize insurance companies to keep paying for OxyContin and keep paying for the opioids by offering rebates for even people who have died from overdoses, right? Because so many people were dying from overdoses. They thought that if Purdue offered a drug rebate based on those deaths, that the insurance companies would keep paying. They also advised Purdue on how to deal with grieving families who were losing loved ones to the overdoses, how to message that. McKinsey paid a settlement of close to $500 million for a full release for their role in the overdose crisis. They are a super evil consulting company. I can't stand anything that has the sentence McKinsey on it. To your second part around for-profit rehab.
Just to interrupt, Ryan, in your book, you quote the rare apology, according to the New York Times, that McKinsey issued in December 2020. I guess this is on the occasion, just before they agreed to pay 47 states and District of Columbia $573 million. Here's McKinsey's statement, quote, "As we look back at our client service during the opiate crisis, we recognize that we did not adequately acknowledge the epidemic unfolding in our communities or the terrible impact of opiate abuse and addiction on millions of families across the country," end quote. That's an apology with monetized glasses on, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's kind of ridiculous too, because McKinsey was working for Purdue up until just the last couple of years, right? They were advising them up until the last couple of years. They knew what was happening. Purdue's role in the overdose crisis isn't something that just happened in the last 5 years. McKinsey knew exactly what they were up to, but Purdue had a lot of money and they had a lot of money to pay. And the almighty dollar always wins out when it comes to, when you get two companies like that together. To your second question on for-profit rehabs, absolutely people can find help and get better without having to go through some of these for-profit rehabs. Let's remember that a lot of these for-profit rehabs, the addiction treatment business in this country is a $30 billion annual industry. They benefit from repeat customers, right? I went through so many for-profit rehabs that did not work. And I ended up going through revolving doors. Over half of them don't offer evidence-based care. that we know works, evidence-based treatment, medications for opioid use disorder, right? I mean, that is a crime in itself. It is a hugely underregulated industry in this country that has an extraordinary criminal underbelly to it. If treatment is available, and treatment should be available, it should be on demand. In my opinion, it should be free. It should be covered, 100% under Medicaid or Medicare. We should be treating addiction in primary care facilities. We should be treating it in hospital emergency rooms. This cottage industry of for-profit $30 billion industry of these, fancy Malibu rehabs is broken. It is broken, but it rakes in the dollars because they prey on the intersection of greed and fear. It's greedy companies, greedy rehabs that prey on fearful families. And they tell these families when their loved one needs help that if they don't get to their facility, if they don't mortgage their house, if they don't open up a credit line to pay $30,000, $40,000 cash a month to get their loved one in there, that they will die. Their loved one will die. It's criminal. My mother went into debt when I was using for over 10 years, close to $500,000 that she doesn't have, that we're still paying off today, almost a decade later, still paying off today at an extraordinary interest rate from many of these same individuals and same companies. It's a crime.
Ryan, I would like you to describe a scene that you do so well at the very beginning of your book about a protest that you attended in 2018 in front of the Purdue Pharma building. And if you could describe that, recreate that for our listeners and what you saw going on the third floor, I think that would probably put a human emotional face on all of this.
In August of 2018, I led a protest with a dear friend of mine, Cheryl Jouer, who lost her son to an Oxycontin overdose several years ago, and who actually lost her second son in June to an opioid overdose. We led a protest of about 500 family members, people impacted, people whose lives were destroyed by Oxycontin in front of Purdue Pharma's headquarters. It was a summer day. It was very loud. You could hear people shouting from the rooftops. There were signs of friends and family members that we had lost. There was a lot of anger. There was a lot of rage. We wanted the company at the time to divest their profits into harm reduction, treatment, supportive services for grieving families. And it was a serious moment for us. And as we were making this request from a bullhorn in front of the office of Purdue in Stamford, Connecticut, there was a line of police officers protecting the building. They were there because Purdue asked them to be there to protect the company. And you could look up onto the third floor where there was a balcony. And there were a few Purdue employees who had their phones out and they were taping us. But they weren't just taping us, they were laughing at us. They were pointing at us and laughing at us as we were making this plea, as we were there, spilling our hearts out, just full of grief and emotion and passion. They thought it was a joke. And, I think it was a telltale sign for what was to come. I think that the Sacklers still think we're a joke. And in certain respects, I think some of us feel foolish, especially on the advocacy front, because we fought so hard for so long, for so many years, and look at the outcome that's about to happen. It's sad, but I would say, Ralph mentioned hope. While my belief in justice for my community, is genuine, my faith in the justice system is tarnished right now. But I still believe that on the other side of this, some good can come. I think a lot of people have worked very hard to put transparency into this process, and hopefully Unsettled has done that. And we can all work together to ensure this doesn't happen again, because unless we reform the system, this will continue to happen. It may not be opioids. It'll just be another, deadly issue or evil corporation using these laws that have harmed so many victims across this country.
Ryan, some listeners may be skeptical now and say, well, it's consumers' own fault. They should have been more careful. But in your book, you show the amazing level of deceptive advertising, saying no serious side effects, mislabeling, seductive marketing, and a lot of this promotion found its way to the doctor's office too, and they bought into this as well. And that misled, of course, their own patients. So that's why your book is all about the details. It's all about the details that listeners should really be very aware of, because this is an addiction culture. There are going to be other addictions, other corporations like Purdue Pharma. They already exist. It's not just the tobacco, nicotine drug companies. It's all over. And we need to get rid of this bankruptcy system. We need the rule of law. We need tougher federal and state criminal laws, tough penalties, in personam indictments and convictions of the corporate crooks and those who benefit directly from these kinds of crimes. And so it should be a big political issue for campaigns. We should demand every candidate running for office to answer the question, what's your position on corporate crime? What are you going to do about corporate crime? Why are you so soft on corporate crime? Well, we're out of time, unfortunately. It's worth reading this book only for the conclusion, not just the rest of the book. The conclusion is titled The Way Out. So we've been talking with Ryan Hampton, author of the book Unsettled, How the Purdue Pharma Bankruptcy Failed the Victims of the American Overdose Crisis. And it's really a snapshot of a lot more that's going on around this country that has to be corrected. These politicians have got to be held accountable or replaced at the local, state, and national level, because we have very small reach toward these big companies. Again, the only countervailing force to deal with them is our government, state and federal, and starts with the Congress as well. Thank you very much, Ryan, and good luck on your future efforts, because you're not going to give up, and you have a broad-range vision of what needs to be done, not just palliative, but preventive.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you.
We have been speaking with Ryan Hampton. We will link to his important work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, Ralph is going to answer your questions. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, December 3, 2021. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Boston Celtics center Enes Kanter this week became a U.S. citizen and continued his campaign against Nike for its labor practices in China. We need to call out these companies, Kanter told the Hill newspaper. Nike, the biggest sponsor of the NBA. In America, they stand with Black Lives Matter, Latino community, No Asian Hate, and the LGBTQ community. But when it comes to China, they remain silent. Kanter has also been getting into it with Lakers and Nike star LeBron James. Kanter tweeted, "Money over morals for the king," and wore sneakers portraying James bowing down to get crowned by Chinese dictator Xi Jinping. James accused Kanter of trying to use my name to create an opportunity for himself. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scroven, along with David Feldman and Ralph. And we have a listener question. David, why don't you sound that out for us?
This question comes to us from Rich Korn, and the topic is Medicare Advantage Plus. Ralph, as you may already be aware, the leaders of the various unions representing employees of New York City, such as teachers, firemen, and police, have entered into an agreement to strongly encourage the retired members of these unions to switch from their current health care insurance plan to one called Medicare Advantage Plus. This is being done in part at the behest of Mayor Bill de Blasio, who says the city can no longer afford the current system. Under the current plan, the retirees are on traditional Medicare and are given a choice of Medicare supplemental insurance plans, at least partly paid for by the city. The new plan would affect about 250,000 city retirees. The retirees are given the option of staying with the current plan, but to do so, they must submit an opt-out request. Those who do nothing are automatically placed in the new plan. Either way, the new system will require deductibles and copays that never existed before. Retired teachers who choose to stay with the existing plan will now have to pay approximately $4,000 or $5,000 to keep the coverage they have been getting all along. What are your thoughts on this, Ralph?
Well, Rich, my first thought is send your message to Eric Lipton at the New York Times, Lipton, Eric Lipton, and to singlepayeraction.org, because they need to have that kind of information. The collaboration of labor unions with an opt-out requirement on their retirees with what I call Medicare disadvantage, which is just corporate health insurance, corporation insurance, which is just corporate insurance, undermining traditional Medicare and getting cross-subsidized by traditional Medicare, is a scandal. And I'm glad you raised this. And my message to the labor unions is you better look into this, because you're coercing your retirees and you're not leveling with them, because it's not what you pay, it's what you get. And with traditional Medicare, you get more when you're sick in terms of reimbursement or bill paying than you do with Medicare Disadvantage. Medicare Disadvantage, in their publicity, they offer some services like for vision and ear care. But when you're really sick, that's when the corporate fangs come out and they drive you up the wall in terms of trying to avoid paying for your expenses. It's not what you pay, it's what you get, is what Dr. Fred Hyde summed up Medicare Disadvantage. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Thanks for your answer, Ralph. I want to thank our guest again, Ryan Hampton. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Ralph Nader wants you to join the Congress Club. Go to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website, and in the top right margin, click on the button labeled Congress Club to get more information. We've also added a button right below that with specific instructions about what to include in your letters to Congress.
And the American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. You don't have to be a law student to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history. Just head to thetortmuseum.org.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Remember, ask all political candidates running for office, what's your position on corporate crime?
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up. Unfortunately, we don't have any wrap-up this week, but I wanted to take this time to say thank you again to all of the people who have supported the show over the years. We really appreciate each and every one of you. From the staff at Ralph Nader Radio Hour, we wish you and yours a safe and happy holiday season. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long. Thieves in the temple, too much money changing hands. It's really very simple. Just make a list of demands. We demand freedom. We demand equality. We demand justice. It ain't gonna happen until folks like you and me just stand up. Well, you've been sitting way too long. Oh, stand up. You know what's right and you know what's wrong. Rise up. Don't let the system hold you down. Stand up, stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Well. Say you're tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person. And who will hear your voice? Don't Don't let them fool you. You have the power in your hand. I'm only trying to school you. Listen to me, people. Do you understand? We gotta stand up. Oh, you've been sitting way too long. Oh, step up. You know what's right and you know what's wrong. Rise up. Don't let the system hold you down. Stand up. Hey, stand up. Hey, you've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, you should. Oh, step up. Step up. I think that you should step up. Rise up. Rise up and take on the power. Stand up. Hey, stand up. Hey, you've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, stand up. Oh, step up. Step up. You ought to step up. Rise up. Rise up. I know you ought to rise up and stand up. Hey, stand up. Hey, you've been sitting way too long. Stand up. I think you step up. Step up. I think that you should step up. Rise up. Don't let the system hold you down. Stand up. Hey, stand up. Hey, you've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Stand up. Step up. Step up. I think you should step up. Rise up. And you rise up because you have the power. Stand up. Stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Stand up. You step up. Step up. I think that we all should rise up. And you rise up. And you rise up. Stand up. And you rise up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up. Stand up. Stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up. Stand up. Stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up. Stand up. Stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up. Step up. It's in your hand. Hey. Rise up. And you rise up. Stand up. Stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up.